Hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Stanton, your 2024 Residential Forms Chair, along with Addison Russell, our General Counsel, and we're here today to discuss mid-year forms changes. So first of all, you may have noticed on July 1, we had a forms change go out. And just to let you know, to clarify, that change was in regard to some recent legislation that passed that had to do with sinkholes and how they're defined in the state law. And so in order to be compliant with that legislation, we issued a July 1 forms update. It only affected basically the property condition disclosure, the exemption, and the disclaimer notice, just those 4 forms. But what we're here to talk about today are the changes we've needed to make to our forms to be compliant with the NAR settlement that happened on March 15th. So as you may remember, NAR settled the lawsuits, commission lawsuits, on March 15th, and in doing so, released all Realtor members from any liability. They also released a large majority of the brokerages from any liability. They significantly reduced the penalty that was imposed on NAR. And finally, they put into place some practice changes for Realtors to go into effect on August 17th, and those changes impacted our forms. So basically, and again, many of you know this, but compensation is to come off MLS altogether on August 17th. Written agreements will now be required between buyers and their agents prior to showing property. That will include the compensation that the buyer's agent is to receive. There was also some language in the settlement that reiterated what we've all already known to be true, that commissions are negotiable, but we needed to make that even more clear in our forms. And then finally, an amendment will be required for any buyer representation agreement in place prior to August 17th that would basically address and include the settlement changes into those existing agreements.
And I will add, that's for any buyer rep agreement in which a purchase and sale agreement has not been executed yet.
Very good. So if you're just shopping and you don't have a purchase and sale, you don't have to. Very good. So the goal of the committee was to review all of those requirements and ensure that when August 17th arrives, that our forms are compliant with all of the changes. And I am very happy and frankly relieved to say that the committee has met that goal and our forms are compliant and ready. But while the committee was discussing all of these changes, we had so many questions. Questions about how might our business practice change in regard to the settlement changes? How might our conversations with buyers and sellers, how might those need to change? Can forms help us with that? What may the Department of Justice do? That still remains to be seen. The committee has been very closely watching the developments in California and other states across the nation to see how everyone is reacting to some of these unknowns that we see in the days ahead. So what the committee decided to do was take a cautious approach and first and foremost, make sure the forms are compliant and then continue to meet regularly, at least every month, review new changes as they arrive, gather feedback from our members, and I'm certain additional changes very likely will come in the days ahead. Okay. So for now, let's take a first look. I'll turn it over to you, Addison, at our new changes.
Okay, and just to piggyback off what Cindy said as to where the Forms Committee landed was to take a cautious approach and just really get our forms in full compliance with the settlement so our members can be in full compliance. And really the good news about where we were as a state association already was very few changes were needed. We weren't having to reinvent the wheel as maybe some other local associations or state associations across the country found themselves doing. But that we could make slight modifications to our existing forms to come into compliance and so that everyone can have the tools that they need on August 17th. So the first form we'll look at is our listing agreement, RF 101. And if you'll scroll down to Section 6 there, these are really the changes we're going to focus on. Section 6 just recognizes seller concessions. This wasn't addressed in our previous listing agreements, and since concession fields are becoming a new option in the MLS, we wanted to just make to take this opportunity to make sellers aware that that's an option, and also that buyers may ask for certain concessions throughout the process, and whether that's a home warranty, repairs, or buyer broker compensation, just kind of putting that out to consumers here that might come up throughout a process. Then we did rework our compensation section slightly. You'll see right there, broker compensation is not set by law and compensation rates are fully negotiable. As Cindy said, we've always known that. And we've had similar language in all of our agreements, but this is the language verbatim from the settlement agreement that has to be in any document a consumer signs. And so we put it here in bold and all caps, just so that the consumer, that's the first thing they see when you start the conversation about compensation. Then it just kind of talks to compensation to broker for sale. This is the compensation to the listing broker. This is what your services cost. If you're a listing broker, you will enter in that number here. And then below that is a section for cooperating compensation. So if you and the seller are agreeing to offer cooperating compensation, this is where you will put that amount in. And you will see we did bold it. This percentage shall be taken from the percentage paid to the listing broker. So it's a number coming from the number that's on line 62 there. It's coming from that amount. It is not in addition to that amount. And then just kind of highlighting compensation to broker for lease. This is existing language that's always been in there, but trying to break it down so a consumer can easily see what monies are owed and when pursuant to the agreement. And then we'll scroll down just a little bit. This language, this is our cooperating compensation currently, but we have rewritten it as above, and we're taking out the MLS participation. So if you're offering cooperating compensation, it will be to any broker assisting a buyer in a transaction and will not be contingent on whether they are a member of your MLS or not a member of your MLS. And so those are really the only changes that we made to the listing agreement. As you can see, it shouldn't really change how you're practicing much, but trying to just make it more concise. Okay, our next change will be the buyer rep agreement. And scrolling down to section 3, these are being removed, but they're really just being rewritten in a new section called compensation, which is section 4. And again, we have that language required by the settlement that broker compensation is not set by law and compensation rates are fully negotiable. Under section A, the compensation for broker services, this is what you charge for your services when acting as a buyer's agent. What do your services cost in this transaction? B is where you are authorized as a buyer's broker to negotiate with the seller or the seller's agent for that cooperating compensation. And then C is kind of to let the buyer know that if you're not being offered cooperating compensation in the amount that your services cost, they will be responsible for the difference. So again, this can come into play if there is no cooperating compensation being offered, or the cooperating compensation is less than what your services, the fee you're charging for your services. Then we see if the buyer leases what they will owe you. And then the cap on compensation is new language pursuant to the settlement agreement. The settlement agreement requires that buyer agreements have compensation rates that are objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. And then it also says that you cannot receive more than what is agreed to by the buyer in a buyer rep agreement. So therefore, even if cooperating compensation is being offered that is more than the agreement stated under 4A, you can only accept 4A from the listing broker unless you execute an amendment to this agreement and your buyer agrees. And then the VA buyer language is remaining. We just put a section header there, even though the temporary guidance, this is outside of the settlement, but something the Forms Committee did talk about, that the temporary guidance from the VA no longer says that buyer broker compensation is not allowable if you're an MLS, if you are an MLS participant and these new practice changes have been implemented. But we did leave that language in there since that guidance was only temporary. And that's something that, as Cindy said, we really tried to focus on just the settlement changes, but I'm sure that's a conversation the Forms Committee will continue to have. Okay. And again, those were the only changes made in the buyer rep agreement, so I don't imagine that should be a big change to your business practice either.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed over the years being on forums is the intent is always to make as little disruption as possible. You know, we know that you know the forms as they are, and for us to make a significant change, there has to be a really significant reason to do that. So
definitely. We're moving on to our current RF 143. And currently this agreement is the non-exclusive buyer representation agreement. But this will be kind of one of the bigger changes pursuant to the settlement. As Cindy stated, the settlement does require a written agreement with a buyer before touring a home. We have the RF 141, which is our buyer rep agreement, which I would encourage you to continue to use. Just have your buyers sign those before you go look at homes. But if you are a Realtor member and you choose not to practice agency relationship, or you're entering into a non-exclusive agency relationship, this form, as rewritten, that will be published on August 17th, is the form you will use to establish facilitator status with a buyer prior to touring a home. So as I said, we've just reworked our non-exclusive buyer rep agreement and made changes as we scroll through there. There are just slight changes where it's no longer a client, but we're referring to the person as a buyer. And then that language in red has really just been moved down to our compensation paragraph that you'll see here, because we know that all written agreements with buyers have to say how the broker is being paid and by whom. And this is the same language that is in our buyer rep agreement, the 141, just restated here. And then if we'll scroll down to subsection D under 5 or 6. Perfect. Keep scrolling. Right here, this is the biggest change in the form. And as I said earlier, it is a facilitator form, or it can be used to create non-exclusive agency. And this subsection D is where you and the consumer will make that decision. You will either check that you are acting as a non-exclusive designated agent in the transaction, which means that you now owe more duties to the consumer, and those are stated above here. Or you can check the box for facilitator, and the duties owed to all parties are listed above here, and then below we'll get a little more into what a facilitator status means. If no box is checked, then you will be acting as a facilitator in the transaction. We've kept in our agency operations, so if you're acting as a non-exclusive designated agent, you will fill that in right there. Yeah. And then this subsection F is just talking a little more and letting the consumer know what a facilitator status is, that it is allowed under state law in Tennessee. And if you did not select designated agency, then this agreement will be a facilitator agreement. So again, I think, and I'm sure this will be the form that we get the most questions on, but this form is designed to be used for members that do not wish to create an agency relationship, whether that's you as a licensee or the consumer at that time. It just gives you the authority to act as a facilitator and keeps you in compliance with the settlement agreement. Do not be afraid to continue to use RF 141. Begin having it signed before you tour a home.
Yeah, and I would just add that the committee intentionally used the word touring or tour property in the title of this form because that was the exact language used in the settlement. I know a lot of us use the word show property, but we're trying to comply just as strictly as possible to the requirements.
That's right. And so now we're moving on to our purchase and sell agreement. And if we just keep scrolling, there's really just a minor
Look,
change
not a
on
lot
here.
of change.
Not a lot of change. And this is the document that is most commonly used by, all parties. And so I think that that's really the good news is we're trying not to interrupt your practices too much, especially it's the middle of the year. There are already other practice changes happening. But this brokerage, this is where we talked about cooperating compensation, has just been reworked a little bit. That says that compensation is laid out in separate agreements, and it's how you as brokers are being compensated for your services. That compensation may come from more than one party, and then putting in that required language that broker compensation is not set by law and compensation rates are fully negotiable. I know that the question will come as to, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, let's see what's next, as to why we didn't put compensation, a section for compensation in the purchase and sale agreement. And it's a multifaceted answer, and the committee did discuss it at length. But I think if you're in a situation where cooperating compensation is being offered and it's acceptable, just continue to use the compensation agreement that we have available already. And then that's signed by the brokers in the transaction, and the brokers are parties to that agreement, and it secures your payment at closing. And since brokers are not a party to the purchase and sale agreement, that's really the safest option to continue. If you are in a situation where cooperating compensation is not being offered, or it is not enough that the buyer feels comfortable moving forward in a transaction and having to compensate their broker the difference, we did add a special stipulation, which is the next form we're going to discuss, all the way at the bottom, where that can be added into the purchase and sale agreement. If a buyer sees a home they love and they want to come in at full ask, but they can't afford to do so because they may owe their broker money, this is where the buyer and seller can negotiate that as part of the offer. So the special stipulation is there as a tool when needed, but there may be plenty of transactions where you don't have to address it in the purchase and sale agreement. And again, we tried to just stick to the necessary changes to be in line with the settlement. Okay. And then a new form that is introduced that Cindy alluded to earlier is the amendment to any buyer rep agreement entered into prior to August 17th, 2024. August 17th is the date that the practice changes go into effect. August 17th is the date that all these new forms will be available for use, and they will all have August 17th dates at the bottom. But if you have a buyer rep agreement and that a purchase and sale agreement has not been executed, then you will need to fill out this amendment form with your buyer. The reason for this form is really the main part of the settlement that Tennessee forms were already not in compliance with was that compensation had to be objectively ascertainable, not open-ended, and that you could not accept more than what you agreed to with your buyer. So our buyer rep agreements were open-ended in the sense that they allowed a buyer's broker to accept cooperating compensation, whatever was being offered. So we needed to rework that. And that's what's in this amendment. It just rewrites the compensation section. It just reiterates what we talked about earlier that's being put in the newly modified buyer rep agreements. But if you have an existing buyer rep agreement, you need to know that this amendment is out there, and if you don't have a purchase and sale agreement executed, you will need to have your buyer sign this amendment and have a frank conversation about what your services cost and that you cannot accept more than that line there.
Unfortunately, no amendment needed for the listing agreements.
Yeah.
Just your buyer reps.
And so, again, I think to kind of bring it all home is we, as a committee, felt really good about where we were already. And I think that that's kind of apparent by the minimal changes that were needed, and then that we only have this one amendment form to kind of be compliant.
Yes. And I know that many of you will have questions. Feel free to post those to the Tennessee Realtor hotline, legal hotline, and we'll get to those, or directly to Andrea on staff here at Tennessee Realtors.
And we will continue to put out information regarding forms changes between now and August 17th, and then likely even after August 17th, once the practice changes go into effect and we see how things start working, we will continue to push out information.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.